this date is not forgotten. In fact, each year, North Korea has a big parade, a big party, if you will, in commemoration of this date, July 27, 1953. Do you know what North Korea refers to this date as? It is called Victory Day, Victory in the Fatherland Liberation War Day. Victory in the Fatherland Liberation War Day. North Korea still clings to this date and the unfinished business of the Korean War. In fact, according to the North Korean Constitution and the charter to the Korean Workers' Party, the most important official government document in North Korea, the charter to the Workers' Party, it says quite explicitly that North Korea's goal is the ultimate liberation of the Korean Peninsula, meaning the communization of the entire Korean Peninsula and the establishment, literally, establishment of the victory of communism throughout Korea. When you think of the 60-year or so period, to be more precise, perhaps a bit less than 59 years since the end of the war in 1953, when you think of the past 60 years, how many wars have we had in Korea? None. It's been an unstable peace, but a real peace, a de facto peace in the Korean Peninsula since the end of the Korean War in 1953. We've seen 2 military attacks on the South in 2010 alone, the sinking of the South Korean corvette, the Cheonan, in March of 2010, and the shelling of an inhabited island in November of 2010. And these are, of course, grave, dangerous, grave infringements on Korean sovereignty. Acts of war in other parts of the world, they would be considered. And this has been the trend, especially during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, limited North Korean attacks against the South. Yet, despite this kind of instability, we have had real peace, not a breakout of the war over the past 60 years in Korea. When you consider the 60-year or so period leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, how many wars do we have? Let's say from the last decade or so of the 19th century to 1950, June 25th, 1950, the date of the outbreak of the Korean War. Do you know how many wars we have in and surrounding the Korean Peninsula? 4, not including the Korean War. Starting with the war between Qing China and Meiji Japan, the Sino-Japanese War, or dubbed by historians the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Chongil Jongsung in Korean. This war was significant in that Japan really shocked the world by defeating China. Japan was considered by the Chinese, as well as most of the world, to be inferior in size, in population, in wealth, and even in culture. Yet, this small island nation, Japan, shocked the world by defeating China in 1895. And this basically ended the traditional Chinese world order in East Asia. Korea was declared in the treaty that brought the war to an end, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, that Korea was no longer a vassal state of the Chinese Empire. Korea was declared to be free and independent. The Japanese insisted on this, not for purely altruistic motives, but to make the point that China is no longer exercising influence over Korea. As a result of that war, which, by the way, took place on the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria and in the surrounding waters surrounding Korea, as a result of this war, Taiwan became Japan's first colony, colonial possession. And Japanese imperialism, the germination of Japanese imperialism, really gets a spark from victory in this war in 1895. Just 10 years later, we have another war involving Japan, that between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Now this was a real shock. Why? Because Japan's victory over Russia had a huge demographic effect. Not since the Middle Ages had we seen a non-white power defeat a huge white power. It was a true shock. And in the afterglow of victory, there was much admiration for Japan in this country and all around the world, even in Asia. It proved, Japan's victory over Russia proved, if you will, in quotation marks, that success in nation building, building a strong army and navy, were not exclusive to white European powers. Others could do it. And Japan proved that. Unfortunately for the Korean people, as a result of Japan's victory, Korea's sovereignty effectively comes to an end. Now, Korea does not become a formal colony of Japan until 1910. 1910 is when Japan colonizes Korea. But we can say that effectively, as of 1905, the end of the Russo-Japanese War, Korea's sovereignty or Korea's independence was sealed. That is, it comes to an end. Why? Because in the peace negotiations by the principal belligerents, Russia and Japan, which took place, mind you, about 2 hours north of here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and the US President, Theodore Roosevelt, was a key player in this as an intermediary. In the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, it was declared that the powers recognize, as does Russia, the defeated party, Japan's, quote, paramount political, economic, and military interests in Korea, end quote. Paramount political, economic, military interests in Korea. And after that, Japan would impose on Korea a protectorate treaty, as it was said. Japan is now in Korea conducting Korea's foreign relations on behalf of Korea for Korea's own good and protection and guidance. And that meant all the foreign legations, including the US legation, in Korea became superfluous because they would conduct their foreign intercourse with Korea through the Japanese government in Tokyo. So they packed up and left. Korea was effectively abandoned in 1905, and again, Japan's domination over the Korean world was formalized by 1910. Those two wars had a huge effect on Korea. Now, the second Sino-Japanese War, as of 1937, Korea was not a major battleground in this war, but by then Japan's colonial occupation of Korea had become quite mature, advanced, and the Korean peninsula served Japan's war campaign, war efforts in China. Korea was a platform for Japanese goods, Japanese transportation, Japanese war campaign in China, in Manchuria. The next war is, of course, the Pacific War, the big war between the United States and Japan. This war did not take place in the Korean peninsula, yet there were plans for a joint US-Korean Independence Army campaign to invade Korea in the very last phase of the war in 1945. Let me say that again. There is a Korean provisional government, a government in exile, formed in the aftermath of the March 1st independence movement in 1919. Buoyed by President Wilson's declaration with the right to self-determination, and Koreans were not alone in this regard. Oppressed people all over the world held hope that the United States and other big European powers may come to support their independence movement. This did not take place, but Koreans on March 1st, 1919, put on a peaceful demonstration declaring Korean independence and the injustice of Japan's colonial occupation. In the wake of that nationwide movement, on March 1st, 1919, we have a government in exile established in China. Obviously, this would not have been possible in Korea proper due to Japanese authorities being there. But we have a government in exile, the Korean Provisional Government, established in 1919 in Shanghai in April 1919. And thereafter, after much trial and error, we have the establishment of a modestly sized Korean army, Korean young men, volunteers, who received military training for the ultimate purpose of participating in the war against Japan in the early 1940s. Now, there was a campaign, there was a plan between the US OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and the Korean Independence Army to infiltrate the Korean Peninsula. Yet, that plan was not implemented because in the wake of the 2 atomic bombings on Japan in early August, Japan effectively surrendered. Now, this is a long-winded prelude to the basic point that I want to make. One of the lessons since the end of the Korean War and the long peace, if you will, 60 years of peace we've enjoyed in the Korean Peninsula, one of the lessons to me is clearly that a power vacuum in Korea is an invitation to aggression. The reason that we have so many wars in the 60-year period leading up to the Korean Peninsula is due to an imbalance of power. That is, neither the other contenders for the control of Korea, Russia or China or the US or other powers, was strong enough to challenge Japan. Japan was the revisionist power par excellence. Japan was the sole power bent on dominating Korea and advancing into northeastern China and Korea. Revisionist state is a jargon we use in international politics, and as far as jargons go, it's pretty decent. It's useful, I think. What do we mean by that? Well, basically this. A nation state that is unhappy with the international environment in which it finds itself and wants to change that, revise that. Today, the only revisionist state in Northeast Asia is the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the formal name for North Korea. I'm not suggesting that North Korea, as Japan did 100 years ago, is bent on starting a war. I don't think North Korea has come close to instigating another war, starting Korean War II, a second Korean War, ever actually, since the end of the war in 1953. But I think the next big geopolitical shift in the Korean Peninsula will emanate from Pyongyang. And by that, I don't mean, again, a war or an invasion of South Korea necessarily, although that too is within the realm of possibility. But I mean perhaps a regime collapse due to an armed rebellion, insurrection, or other scenarios, a basic change in the status quo in the Korean Peninsula. And that is a diplomatic way of saying the end of the Kim dynasty. Now, when you hear a person refer to even the possibility of the collapse of North Korea, some of you may bristle, some of you may point out quite accurately that prognostications of this kind, predictions of North Korea's collapse, have been around for now nearly 20 years. We know that in the early 1990s, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so forth, many people, if not most, predicted the imminent collapse or the collapse of North Korea in the near future, meaning in about 5 years. It made sense to think in those terms in the 1990s because North Korea is so aid dependent and all Soviet aid came to a stop in the early 90s. How can North Korea go on? We knew at the time very little about Kim Jong-il. We had some patchy images of Kim Jong-il as a hard-drinking playboy who enjoyed a sybaritic lifestyle. Although having attended college here in the United States, I never fully understood the presumption why a sybaritic lifestyle and performance were incompatible. We knew very little about Kim Jong-un and assumed that he would not be up to the challenge because he was a playboy, he liked to party. Well, I think we can say during the 17-year period that he was in power, he proved to the world that as a leader, as a ruthless dictator, he was successful in dealing with his stronger neighbors and in preserving his own power. There was no insurrection, He was able to stay in office until it no longer became possible for him to keep his own mortality at bay. Today, we know even